Welcome to video 3, where we're going to talk about how to recover from an attack when one does happen. As we've seen, the most important part of any protocol is prevention. That is, the measures that you take to both minimise the risk of an attack and the harm that an attack can potentially cause. If your digital security is tight, if you assess the risk of online violence before publication or broadcast, and if you have good support systems in place, attacks are both less likely to occur and less likely to cause significant harm when they do occur. But it is impossible, of course, to prevent online abuse and harassment entirely. So what happens when an attack does happen? What should the newsroom do then? By now, you've surveyed your journalists to better understand the scale and nature of the problem in your newsroom. You've done an audit of your existing response to identify strengths and weaknesses of your current approach, and you've blueprinted a better preventative protocol. Now it's time to start work on a recovery blueprint. Again, we're going to use the 4 steps in IPI's protocol, but this time, think about how they can be employed when an attack does occur. So first of all, a quick recap. The 4 steps are reporting, risk assessment, implementing support mechanisms, and tracking and reassessment. And here they are again, showing this time as stages in a cycle rather than discrete steps in a linear process. So, step 1, reporting. When thinking about prevention, we saw the need for clear reporting lines, but this is just the first step. If an attack happens and it is reported, it is vital that the journalist who has been targeted gets a response that is rapid, human, and effective. In a small newsroom, it's relatively easy to be responsive. In a larger organisation, it's very easy for reports to get lost. So it's good practice to establish a single contact culture. Rather than put the responsibility on the individual to decide if what they are experiencing is a digital security problem or a physical security problem or an HR problem, all reports are made to the single email address. This might be the same email address that is used for all security queries and one that is known by everyone. Having a single contact simplifies the process of reporting and lowers the bar to reporting. Freelance journalists should also have access to this email. Now you need to think about who picks up this report and what happens to it. In a large newsroom, it's likely to be a team of people who review the report. In terms of expertise, this team might include a senior editorial member of staff, someone who can provide context and editorial judgment. It will include an expert in physical and digital security, as well as a legal expert who can evaluate whether the online behaviour meets the threshold for legal action. It should also include someone from human resources to offer appropriate support for the targeted individual. In a small newsroom, you might only have one person who responds to reports of online harassment and abuse, but they will need training and they may need access to additional technological or legal expertise. Working out how best to respond to online abuse can be complicated. But regardless of your setup, it's important that the individual being targeted receives a response that is both rapid and human. So the respondent needs to send an email or pick up the phone to reassure the targeted person that the matter is in hand and to offer any immediate support that may be needed. What this immediate support is depends on the nature of the attack. If it's a credible death threat, then the journalist should be taken to a place of safety. If it's a sexist pile-on, offering to monitor the journalist's social media accounts and screenshot the abuse before reporting, blocking and deleting might be welcomed. If it is undermining the journalist's professionalism, counter-speech might make the person targeted feel supported by their colleagues. An important part of coming up with a recovery blueprint is working out who will respond to reports and making sure they're equipped to offer immediate reassurance and support. And in many cases this is enough. A journalist who's been targeted has the support of their colleagues, and this will prevent psychological harm. Step 2 is risk assessment. Once immediate support has been offered, the responder or response team must look in more detail at the attack to assess the risk to the individual and the institution. This will include the likelihood that an online threat could turn into a physical attack. The damage caused to the reputation and credibility of the journalist and/or the news organisation must also be considered, as must the emotional impact on the targeted journalist. Risk assessment is not an exact science and will always involve a judgment call. It should also be done in consultation with the individual who's been targeted. Online harassment can be a very disempowering experience, and those targeted must not lose their sense of agency when it comes to responding. Any assessment of the risk of physical attack needs to take into consideration the overall security environment in which the attack takes place. In a context in which physical attacks against journalists are frequent, threats need to be dealt with very seriously. You will need to consider the possibility of relocating the journalist, requesting police protection, and pushing for serious investigations into the origin of the threats. However, it is also important to keep in mind that online threats have resulted in physical attacks against journalists, even in environments generally perceived as safe. To give you a sense of how a risk assessment might be done, let's look at two scenarios in which there might be a risk of physical attack. First, a journalist has been targeted by an isolated attack in which explicit death threats are made. The assessment should focus on determining who the aggressor is so as to assess the likelihood that the threat might turn into a physical attack. This assessment should be made on the basis of any information available about the aggressor, in particular their past social media behaviour and the content they've shared. Explicit threats of physical harm and cyberstalking should be reported to the authorities. In a second scenario, a journalist is the target of a coordinated campaign. In this case, the assessment might focus on the likelihood that others may feel encouraged or legitimised by this campaign to physically attack the journalist. Journalists who work on camera, or who are otherwise easily recognisable in public, run a greater risk of being physically attacked. The risk of physical attack may also be higher if the coordinated harassment is legitimised, supported, or even initiated by a high-level politician or other well-known public figure. However, most online harassment and smear campaigns are designed not to physically harm the target, but to damage their reputation. Because trust and credibility are core aspects of successful journalism, it's in the interest of news organisations and journalists to take all necessary measures to protect themselves against such attacks and to counter the smears. Assessing the damage that online attacks can cause will be helpful in determining the amount of resources that need to be invested in countering them. Again, there are various questions you might ask as part of any assessment of reputational risk. You might ask yourself whether this is taking place in an already polarised or hostile climate. Online smear campaigns are more likely to attract the attention of audiences if there is already hostility towards your journalism or this particular journalist. You need to consider how credible the smear is. By definition, smear campaigns disseminate false information, but some is more believable than others. The degree of credibility that a smear campaign appears to have will determine its ability to turn audiences against targeted journalists or news organisations and therefore affect their reputation. The more credible the smear, the more you might feel it necessary to counter it. You should also consider the volume, reach and engagement of the smear campaign. For example, the use of memes can cause messages to be carried further more quickly, as can the use of popular hashtags or the use of bots, which can increase dissemination exponentially. The use of specific labels to describe journalists that can catch on, such as enemy of the people. Even if the smear campaign itself does not last, these labels are often recycled over and over and over again to undermine the credibility of the journalist or the media outlet. You also might want to consider the potential that the campaign will be picked up by propaganda websites, which may further spread the campaign's message, and also whether the campaign appears to be orchestrated. The involvement of an influential public figure with a large social media following in targeting, directly or indirectly, a journalist increases the spread of the campaign. The attack might then be shared widely by the figure's followers, who will repost and share organically, creating a much wider narrative in order to discredit the target. It's a good idea to ensure that someone in your team, perhaps the head of audience, understands how to track social media activity and identify organised networks on social media. In assessing the risk of emotional impact, both external and internal factors need to be assessed. By external factors, I mean both the characteristics of the attack itself and the available support structures. By internal factors, I mean the individual's own reaction to the attack. Let's look at external factors first. The risk of emotional impact is higher if the content is discriminatory. IPI research has shown that online attacks targeting male journalists who belong to a majority group and attacks targeting women or members of minorities are fundamentally different, not only in numbers but also in content. Women journalists and members of minority groups are more likely to receive online comments targeting them as individuals and attacking their particular identity. Attacks that criticise their professional output are less frequent than ones that insult their physical appearance or their perceived belonging to a particular gender or ethnic group. This type of content tends to harm the targeted individual more than even the harshest professional criticism. The risk of emotional impact is also higher if the content includes traumatic images, which can be very harmful to journalists, especially if they're repeatedly exposed to violent, gruesome or threatening images, and especially in the case of women journalists who are often targeted with vivid imagery of rape threats or threats of physical harm. It has been shown that such images can be traumatic and that journalists may even develop PTSD as a result. Also, images are more likely to be reposted and shared multiple times, and so the potential exposure of the journalist to traumatic imagery increases. The risk of emotional impact is also higher if the attack includes stalking. Comments that are personal or creepy, in particular those targeting women journalists and that appear to come from a cyberstalker, generate fear and a sense of insecurity for the targeted journalist. The risk of emotional impact is also higher if the journalist does not have a good support network. Journalists told IPI that while professional psychological help is necessary in some cases, the ability to simply talk with trusted people about the attacks can serve as a source of relief and strength. The degree of access to any type of support network, including family, friends, colleagues, can influence the level of emotional burden caused by online harassment. So when assessing the risk of emotional impact, it is vital to talk to the journalist who has been targeted and assess their state of mind. Trauma risk management training, or TRIM, should be offered at least to those members of staff who will be assessing the risk of emotional harm, so that they can recognise the signs of distress and trauma and respond appropriately. In certain cases, the emotional distress caused by online harassment and abuse might affect their performance at work, for example. The targeted journalist may experience changes in their eating or sleeping habits, or they might turn to drugs or alcohol. They might show signs of depression, such as self-critical behaviour, apathy, or low level of performance at work. And in extreme cases, targeted journalists may show symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, including an inability to switch off, hypervigilance, nightmares, intrusive memories, and a general feeling of fear and intimidation. The use of trauma risk management training, or TRIM, enables newsroom staff to identify which journalists need support and to assess when to seek professional help. Professional psychological support should be part of your armoury. Professional mental health support can play an important role in helping mitigate the consequences of online abuse and harassment of journalists. As good practice, media outlets should ensure that journalists have access to mental health care, either through the organisation's health plan or through ad hoc arrangements made between the media outlet and mental health professionals. Although online abuse and any resulting psychological impact should not be accepted as characteristics of modern journalism, it is essential that media outlets destigmatise mental health counselling in the context of such attacks. The fact is that online abuse exists and psychological support can sometimes be needed in response to it. Prompt and appropriate emotional support can prevent long-term emotional harm.